Welcome back to Tell Me More Stories Told as podcast, the show where we dive deep into some of history's most interesting stories. Today, we're going back to 1994, a year that was, I think we can all agree, really defined by one particular trial, the O.J. Simpson trial.
Yeah, it wasn't just any trial. It had it all. Fame, fortune, a brutal crime, and just a whole web of evidence that nobody could seem to untangle.
Right. So let's set the scene. June 12th, 1994. We're in Brentwood, Los Angeles, an affluent neighborhood. And the story starts with this really chilling discovery. Nicole Brown Simpson, O.J. Simpson's ex-wife, and her friend Ron Goldman, they're found murdered, brutally murdered, right outside of Nicole's condo.
And of course, the main suspect is O.J. Simpson, this beloved NFL star, an actor, a household name, really. It was unbelievable to a lot of people. To see this all-American hero become the center of this murder investigation.
Yeah, I mean, from the very beginning, the media just went crazy. It was a global phenomenon. I mean, this wasn't just a local news story. Everyone was talking about this.
And it wasn't even just about the murder itself. The prosecution really wanted to show this darker side of O.J. They really wanted to focus on the history of domestic violence and his relationship with Nicole, to try to show that he was a man capable of this, this rage, this violence, that culminated in this horrific act.
Right, and they presented all this evidence of that, right?
Yeah.
Police reports, witness testimonies. There was even that really chilling 911 call from years before where you can hear Nicole's fear and you can hear O.J.'s anger.
Yeah, it was important for them to do that because they wanted to show this pattern of escalating violence. It wasn't just about putting O.J. at the crime scene. It was about establishing his motive.
Okay, so let's rewind a little bit. Back to the night of the murders, June 12th, 1994. The prosecution really tried to piece together a timeline leading up to the murders, and they were trying to use that to put O.J. at the crime scene when he said he had an alibi.
Yeah, they used phone records, witness testimonies, especially from Cato Kalin. He was a friend who was staying at O.J.'s guest house, and they used the limo driver's account. He was supposed to pick O.J. up for his flight to Chicago that night, but there was this gap, like an hour or so, where they couldn't account for where O.J. was.
Right, the infamous missing hour. That really became like a central point of the entire trial because the prosecution said that that was when the murders happened. But the defense really tried to challenge that. They said that their timeline wasn't reliable.
Yeah, they brought in their own forensic experts.
Yeah.
To suggest that the murders could have happened later.
So you have these two sides, each trying to create their own narrative, the prosecution trying to fill that gap in the timeline, and the defense trying to exploit it, to introduce that element of doubt.
Exactly.
And as all of this was happening, the media was just going crazy. Every court appearance was on camera. Every witness interview. The public was completely captivated.
This was a huge moment for the 24-hour news cycle. It showed how media coverage could shape public perception, really influence the narrative of a case.
And then things took an even more dramatic turn. Because instead of turning himself in, O.J. took off in this white Ford Bronco with his friend Al Cowlings, leading the police on this low-speed chase that was broadcast live across the country.
It was unbelievable. Millions of people watching this happen live. It was more than just a chase. It was like a national experience, this conversation playing out in real time.
I mean, it's such a powerful image, and it got such a mixed reaction from people. Some people saw it as this desperate act from an innocent man. They were holding up signs in support of him. But other people were just horrified and saw it as an admission of guilt.
Right, and it really showed how divided people were, especially along racial lines. And those divisions only intensified as the trial went on.
Before we move on to talk about the trial itself, I want to remind everyone listening to hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss the rest of our deep dive into this case. We're going to unpack all of the legal strategies, talk about the key players, and discuss that shocking verdict that divided the nation.
We'll be back in a minute to dissect what became known as the trial of the century, so the O.J. trial. It was this incredible courtroom battle, but it was also a battle that was happening in the court of public opinion, driven by all the media attention.
Yeah, and his defense team, the Dream Team, they had a huge task in front of them. I mean, they had to completely dismantle the prosecution's story and create enough doubt to convince the jury.
And they were really good at that. They focused on a few key things. First, they really went after the LAPD, especially Detective Mark Furman. He was one of the first officers at the crime scene.
And this is where the issue of race really comes in, because Furman had a history of making racist comments, and the defense used that to suggest that he might have planted evidence, to frame O.J.
It was brilliant. Johnny Cochran. He was the lead defense attorney. He was a master strategist. And he used Furman's racism to tie into this bigger story about the LAPD's history of racial bias and misconduct. especially against black men.
He was basically saying to the jury, if you believe they've done this before, why wouldn't you believe they'd plant evidence in this case? He was making them face this really uncomfortable truth about racial prejudice in the justice system.
And it was a really smart move, especially given what was going on in society at the time. I mean, this was only a few years after the Rodney King beating and the LA riots, events that really shook people's trust in the LAPD.
Right. Cochran was tapping into this feeling in the black community, this anger and resentment towards the police. So he made the trial about more than just whether O.J. was guilty. It became about systemic racism and the fight for justice.
The defense also went after the prosecution's DNA evidence, which was pretty new at the time.
Can you imagine being on that jury? I mean, DNA evidence was this brand new thing, and you have all these experts arguing about whether it's reliable, talking about contamination, mishandling of samples. How do you even begin to make sense of all of that?
It was a fascinating legal battle, and it really changed how we look at and use DNA evidence today. The Simpson trial forced the legal system to deal with this new technology and the possibility of mistakes. And it showed the need for really careful procedures.
We can't forget about one of the most memorable parts of the trial, the glove. The glove. The prosecution had these blood-stained gloves, one found at the crime scene and one found at O.J.'s house. And they said they belonged to the killer and had traces of O.J.'s blood, Nicole's blood, and Ron's blood.
And then, in a move that a lot of people think changed the whole trial, they asked O.J. to try on the gloves right there in front of the jury.
It was a big risk. And it didn't work out for them. The gloves looked too small for O.J.'s hands. He could barely get them on, and they just looked awkward. And that image of O.J. struggling with those gloves, it was everywhere. And it became a symbol of how the prosecution was messing up.
It played right into the defense's hands.
And Johnny Cochran. He used that moment perfectly. In his closing arguments, he said something that everyone remembers. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit.
It was brilliant.
That line became this rallying cry for O.J.'s supporters. And people still debate it today. Was it just a smart legal tactic? Or was it a sign that the justice system had failed?
However you look at it, it was a turning point. It really planted the idea of reasonable doubt in the jurors' minds.
After months of testimony, and all the drama in the courtroom, and all the media attention, the case finally went to the jury.
And after talking it over for a surprisingly short time, they came back with their decision.
On October 3rd, 1995, O.J. Simpson was found not guilty on both counts of murder.
And that verdict shocked the country. It revealed all these deep racial and social divisions that the trial had brought to the surface.
I mean, it felt like the whole world just stopped, waiting to hear that verdict. And when it came, it really revealed how divided the country was.
Yeah, you could see it immediately in the reactions. In black communities, people were celebrating. They saw it as a win against a system that they felt was biased against them, a system that hadn't treated black men fairly.
But a lot of white Americans, they couldn't believe it. They were outraged. They felt like the evidence was clear and that this was a miscarriage of justice.
Yeah, it was a stark contrast that showed just how much racial tension there was in America, and the trial just brought all of that to the surface.
The O.J. Simpson trial wasn't just a trial. You know, it was this huge cultural event. It changed America. It made people talk about domestic violence, about using DNA in the justice system, about how celebrities can influence public opinion.
It also changed the media. I mean, it was the beginning of the 24/7 news cycle. Cable news just kept talking about it, analyzing every little detail.
It was like a real-life soap opera, playing out in real time. But it also forced us to think about some really uncomfortable things, about our own biases and the problems with our justice system.
It made us question everything, the role of race in the courts, how the media can shape what people think, even the idea of truth and justice.
And even now, all these years later, the O.J. Simpson trial is still relevant. It reminds us how complicated the justice system is. It reminds us that we're still fighting for racial equality. And it shows how powerful a story can be, how it can captivate us, but also divide us.
So after going through all of this, what do you think? Did this change how you see the justice system? Or the media? Or even ourselves?
We want to hear what you think. And we hope you'll join us next time for another deep dive into the stories that have shaped our world, right here on Tell Me More Stories Told As podcast.